What if I told you that you're always one decision away from a totally different life? Let me say that again. You're always one decision away from a totally different life. Just one more time, and this is going somewhere, I promise. You're always one decision away from a totally different life. This anonymous quote has been mulling around in my head for a while. Several times in the last few weeks, I've felt it come bubbling up to my conscious mind. There's a permissive possibility in this phrase. It leaves me feeling hopeful about the world, feeling as if transformation and growth are not only possible, but are happening and moving us toward a better world. And then I look around the world and I find myself wondering, is this true? Am I just being overly optimistic? Or maybe even a little bit delusional? Or perhaps I just misunderstand the meaning of things and am confused in general. Those all are possibilities. But I think there's something more. But still, as I look around, I can't help but think, are things improving? I see and hear about all the nightmarish situations unfolding in our own country here. People going without shelter, food, and medical attention. Others living without access to clean drinking water, like in Flint, Michigan. Or access to education as happens here in our own state of Washington. A constant stream of situations that only seem to advance causes that run counter to our Unitarian Universalist principles. Just this week, the news of the decision to declare a state of emergency to allocate funds for a wall along the Mexico-U.S. border. Yet another attempt to divide people in a time when I think we all can agree we need unity. And yet, still, somehow, despite all of these realities, I can't but believe the arc of the universe is slowly and steadily bending towards justice. That somehow, through the decisions we make, we play a role in co-creating a new reality, our present reality. I want to hold on to this line of thinking for just a little while. We'll come back to it, don't worry. But first, I want to turn our attention back to the reading from the book of Acts that I offered just a little bit ago and unpack it. So, somewhere on the road to Damascus, Saul found himself confounded and transformed. The moment of transformation transpired when a bright light enveloped Saul and the voice of Jesus spoke to him, questioning, "Why do you persecute me?" This was a very valid question to ask of Saul. He was a known persecutor of this new sect of Judaism that would eventually grow into what we know as Christianity. The fact of Saul's persecution is attested to when, before his journey, he requests a letter from the high priest in Jerusalem, authorizing Saul to go to the synagogues in Damascus and find any followers of Jesus, bind them, and bring them back to Jerusalem to be punished. But even before Saul requested this letter and prepared himself to journey to Damascus, he had sought to scatter these believers, this new religious community. He sought to drive them abroad into diaspora. But as luck would have it, this only seemed to help spread the new Christian faith. The persecuted people set out and preached as they traveled, dispensing the teachings of their teacher Jesus as they went. This was why Saul needed to go to Damascus in the first place. He needed to put an end to this sect before their teachings really took hold. But somewhere on that road, when the light descended and the voice of Jesus spoke to him, something changed. Something in Saul changed. When the light finally faded and Saul was left without his sight, he eventually regained it. But when he did, he was no longer the same. From then on, Saul went by the name Paul. He was baptized and became a fierce force for propagating Christianity, carrying the seeds of this movement throughout the ancient world, planting a vast network of churches and collecting alms for the poor and widowed he encountered. Now, I do want it to be known that I don't agree with everything that Saul did or said. He's a misogynist by today's standards. And to be honest, he spends a bit more time talking about circumcision than I'm really comfortable with. But I'm not so much interested in these aspects of Paul's teachings. To me, the aspect of this story I find most interesting has to do with the transformation that Saul experienced on his way to Damascus. The sudden change from persecutor to protector and propagator. To me, this is a story of awakening to a new way of being. It's a story about casting off the old ways and making room for the new. It's a story of transformation and redemption. A story that speaks of hope. Hope that allows me to believe that positive change really is possible. It's a story about how one choice, how one action, how one event can radically change reality. The hope for me is in the fact that, like Saul, all of us are always one decision away from a totally different life. This theme of awakening, the theme of transformation that I'm exploring here, isn't limited to the New Testament alone, or even the canon of monotheistic scriptures. It's an archetype found throughout religious teachings, throughout our human history. Part of what I like to call our shared human inheritance. In recognizing this, the ubiquity of the theme of transformation, I feel we are freed from looking at such texts in a strictly literal sense. Instead, we're invited to explore these universal seeds, to delve deeper into the relationship with the themes that we encounter in our own personal lives, wrestling with them and creating meaning, situating ourselves in the context of the larger human story that is still unfolding. So earlier, I shared with the children a sort of abbreviated version of the Buddhist story of the 4 passing sights. The tale of the young prince Siddhartha, and how when he was born, it was foretold that he would either become a great holy man or a wise king. And how Siddhartha's father set him up such that he would never experience any dissatisfaction or discomfort, in hopes of sort of preparing the way for his son to be a king like him. But despite all these attempts to shelter Siddhartha, the young prince still came to an understanding of profound suffering in the world. In the series of events known as the Four Passing Sights, Siddhartha, according to legend, bore witness to a sick person, to an old person, to a dead corpse, before finally encountering a holy man, a spiritual leader who had dedicated their life to finding the cause and end of suffering in the world. In seeing all of these things, the young Siddhartha was changed. Filled with a mix of despair and hope, Siddhartha left home and dedicated himself to ending suffering. He spent the next several years studying different meditation practices, engaging in asceticism, and depriving himself of food, water, and at times even breath. All this in an attempt to find the cause and end to human suffering. But none of these methods for Siddhartha seemed to yield any results. And no one Siddhartha encountered seemed to know either the cause or the end to suffering. So in time, feeling frustrated, Siddhartha left these practices. Exhausted, he sat beneath a Bodhi tree and began contemplating the cause of suffering and its end. And out of this contemplation came the insight that in Buddhist philosophy has become known as the Four Noble Truths. These Four Noble Truths are said to outline the nature and cause of suffering, and then highlight the path towards ending suffering, the Eightfold Path. For the purposes of our service today, I'm not going to go into the finer points of these teachings. Instead, I want to call our attention to the theme of transformation and awakening that is present in this story. In this story, there are two instances of the theme. First, coming after the Four Passing Sights, when Siddhartha is changed, going from his life as a prince in the palace to being a holy man and dedicating himself to ascetic practices. The second, when after reaching a point of frustration, Siddhartha sits beneath the Bodhi tree and eventually attains enlightenment, being transformed and awakening as the Buddha. In both the situations experienced by Siddhartha, a choice was made that shaped his path, catapulting him from his life as a young sheltered prince to his new manifestation as the awakened one. And in both the stories that I've shared so far this morning, the story of Paul and that of the Buddha, as I've already said, I'm less concerned with the literal facts of what is said. I'm not concerned or worried about the dogmatic implications of the teachings put forth in either of these world religions. For me, when considering such ancient texts, I'm more concerned with the universal themes discerned, the seeds germinating and growing into contemporary expressions of our human heritage. On a personal level, I also just happen to find it far more interesting to recognize the fact that two divergent traditions have put forth a narrative that centers the theme of transformation and change, a narrative of metamorphosis and possibility. In recognizing this dynamic, I feel emboldened to restate that permissive possibility in the statement, you are always one decision away from a totally different life. Now, I haven't always held this view. It's something that's kind of grown over time. I would say a few years ago, I would have still allowed myself to become pretty bogged down in the literal facts of what was being said, and then would have delved into sort of the historic dimensions of the story, trying to find what really happened. But somewhere in my own life journey, something changed for me. Something shifted, allowing me to reach this new understanding that I hold. I'm sure that given a few more years, this view will continue to evolve and change. In fact, I welcome that, and I expect that. But for now, I'm going to honor that this is where I'm at. And as part of that honoring, I want to share just a brief version of what I call my own Damascus story. So, when I first thought about going to seminary, I made an appointment to speak with Reverend Lee. Reverend Lee was the interim minister at my home congregation in Bellingham. He was happy to meet with me, but said it might be just a little while before he could fit me into his busy schedule. A reality I've become a little bit familiar with myself. When we finally had an opportunity to meet, we decided to walk around the neighborhood that the church was in. And as we were walking, we began talking and sharing bits of our life story, sort of our family of origin and college journeys. And then suddenly, the conversation took an abrupt turn. And I found myself being interrogated a little bit. And Reverend Lee started asking me all sorts of questions about, well, why do you want to go to seminary? And tell me, what's your call to ministry? At the time, the only answer that I really could seem to muster for these questions was, it just kind of feels like the thing I'm supposed to do. And yet still, despite my own ineloquence, Reverend Lee encouraged my pursuits. From that meeting on, whenever speaking or emailing with Reverend Lee, he'd always start the conversation by asking, "How are things on the road to Damascus?" I generally shy away from the question and then answer sarcastically saying, "It's slow traveling, but I expect to be there in near a fortnight." As I think back on these conversations, I recognize a deeper meaning unfolding. I thought that Damascus was the destination. In reality, I've learned that transformation, that change was the destination. The sort of transformation that can only come from embarking on a journey that allows us to keep open, to stay open and respond to the experiences of the world. It's rarely a light descending from the sky and enveloping us with the voice of Jesus speaking, or a dramatic parade of processing sights of suffering. It's a process that slowly changes who you are until suddenly you find yourself transformed. And it's my belief that how we engage in this process not only shapes who we are in this moment, but shapes who we are becoming. This was a view that really, for me, took root when I recognized this dynamic at play in my own life. I was sleeping in bed still. My husband, Elliott, had already left for work. Suddenly, in the middle of my sleep, I heard a woman's voice, and it woke me. She said, "I baptize you in the name of the Holy Spirit." I shot up in bed. I could feel my heart racing. Confusion ran through me. What's going on, I thought. I opened my eyes, but found an empty apartment. I tried to ignore this experience. I don't have visions. I don't hear disembodied voices. But still, this experience stuck with me. I couldn't deny what I experienced. I wasn't sure what I had experienced, but I couldn't deny that I experienced it. Something inside me changed. To be honest, something had been changing for some time, but something that morning awoken in me, allowing me to realize that the transformation had occurred. Perhaps it was just the stress from my life of preparing sermons and being in classes that I had these religious themes on my head. Perhaps it was that week I was preaching at a Baptist church in the nearby town, so the language of baptism and Holy Spirit was in my head already. Whatever it was, though, it felt a bit like how I imagine when a dam breaks, it would feel. First, the water subtly builds behind filling the reservoir. Then, as the weight becomes more and more, suddenly the structure can hold back the water no more, and the dam bursts, sending a surge of water forth that washes away the old barrier. I didn't realize that's what I signed up for when I enrolled in seminary. I thought I'd get to Damascus and find it to be a bit like all those other schools that I had gone to at this point. You do my classes, I show up, I take some tests, I write some papers, but overall I'm still Zach. I didn't know I was engaging in a process of radical self-transformation. But the reality is that that's what this journey was for me. It opened me to the suffering of those in the world and the need for people to respond to that suffering. Just as Siddhartha, in the story I told earlier, witnessed the suffering in the world and felt called and compelled to respond. Just as Saul, setting out to do one thing, suddenly changed courses and ended up doing another. All this experience, these stories together, compelled me. They changed me. They brought me here through the choices I made. As Unitarian Universalists, when we talk about social justice, we are talking about transformation. We are talking about awakening to a new way of being and raising the level of awareness on situations and important issues we're facing. We're talking about engaging in a process that will take a certain level of endurance and determination, an ability to push through discomfort and misunderstanding. It requires us to stretch, and at times to admit that we can't know, or even that we're wrong. It requires that we not reject an idea in its entirety just because we disagree with a part. We can't keep talking past each other. Instead, I believe we need to learn to speak in terms that emphasize the things we hold in common. We can't keep hyper-focusing on the things we disagree on. Instead, I feel we are called to find those areas we can agree upon. When we learn to do this, when we learn to honor our differences and yet still come together, it's then that I truly believe we will achieve our potential as a faith movement. This is the work of the Church Universal. This is the work of Unitarian Universalism, to transform the world through engaging in the world and steering our engagement towards justice. In all the stories that I have shared today, these moments of awakening, Saul on the road to Damascus, the Prince Siddhartha awakening as the Buddha, and my own experiences, all of these stories speak to the possibility of transformation, of the change that is really possible when we awaken to the needs of those around us, committing ourselves to building community that seeks to overcome division and differences. This is a message I choose to believe in, letting it give shape to the forces that manifest my present reality. Sure, I could choose not to, but if I don't affirm the possibility of change and transformation, there's little point in answering a call to ministry. There seems little point in us gathering in churches and congregations and fellowships. It seems that if transformation isn't possible, there's little point in anything. And I don't believe this is true. And for me, engaging in this transformation is my great spiritual practice. It's embracing the hope that the evils in our world can be overcome, and that our actions and decisions will play a part. For after all, we are always one decision away from a totally different life. May it be so. Amen, and blessed be.